Hello, comparative religions, and welcome to the second lesson this week on Mesopotamia. Now, in the first lesson, we looked at the different city states in Mesopotamia. We talked about Sumer, the first cities. We talked about the Akkadians with King Sargon, the Babylonians with King Hammurabi and the first legal code, the Assyrians, who were very, very militaristic and short lived, the Persians, who had the largest empire but were conquered by Alexander the Great. And we looked at the creation of religion moving from naturalistic polytheism to more pronounced gods and goddesses, and the fact that each city and each city state in Mesopotamia had its own deity that was in charge of the fate of that city, okay? And that led to 2,000 plus gods in Mesopotamia, okay? And we ended up talking about the rulers of the city states were also considered God's representative within that city, and their task was to interpret the will of the gods and goddesses, okay? Well, now we're going to look more at the individual religious beliefs of Mesopotamia. Now, this is not one specific city state, like this is not the Sumerians, this is not the Babylonians, it's an overall view of Mesopotamia. Again, as we work through these, be taking your own lessons. I will try to do a good job telling you, hey, copy all this down, be sure you're copying this slide down, that sort of thing. Be honest with you, unless I tell you don't copy down this slide, copy down what you see, okay? So we're going to be talking more about the individual religious beliefs of the Mesopotamians at this point in time, all right? And we're going to start here with life after death. Mesopotamians did believe in life after death. So in this respects, it is a linear religion, okay? It's not cyclical. There is no reincarnation or rebirth. There is life after death. But it is not a glorious afterlife. In fact, the dead are seen as wretched, abandoned, and restless, and they haunt the living, okay? So in some respects, it's not really like there's a heaven. The afterlife is just a dark, dark place. Okay, it's not really a hell either, but the dead are seen as wretched, abandoned, and haunting the living. Okay, now a lot of what we know about Mesopotamian religion comes from the mythology of Mesopotamia. Okay, and the mythological literature. This literature included adventures and interrelations between man and the gods. Okay, we saw that with King Sargon because his mother was a changeling and we weren't quite sure what that meant. Of course, we have origins of the universe, creation of humanity. So, those things that we would typically associate with the role of God or gods in people's lives, creation, okay, origin, the netherworld, life after death, final plan, cycle of vegetation, okay, plants and crops and seasons and things like that. And an interesting story, and you guys are going to investigate this a little bit on your own, but there is story of a flood. Okay, in fact, there's a story of a flood, a cataclysmic flood, in a lot of civilizations. Now, this flood narrative comes from an epic known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known written story. It is Sumerian in origin, okay, and it was written in cuneiform. And it follows the adventures of King Uruk. Okay, now he is, even though it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, it follows the adventures of King Uruk. And you remember, Uruk is one of the key cities in Mesopotamia. Okay, and in Anu, who is the sky god and the king of all gods, is the god of Uruk. Okay, so I have a feeling that the city is named after the king. All right, and the chief god of all the Mesopotamian deities is the chief deity of this city, probably because of the importance of this king, King Uruk. Now, do not worry about copying down the next slide, all right? But here is a passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? After I'd caused all my family and relations to up into the ship, I caused the game of the field, the beasts of the field, and all the craftsmen into it. I viewed the appearance of the weather. The weather was frightful to behold. I entered the ship and closed my door. 6 days and nights the wind blew. The downpour, the tempest, the flood, which had fought like an army, subsided in its onslaught. The sea grew quiet, the storm abated, the flood ceased. I looked upon the sea, all was silence, and all mankind had turned to clay. I sent forth a dove and let her go. The dove went away and came back to me. There was no resting place, and so she returned. Then I sent forth a raven and let her go. The raven went away and did not return. Then I sent forth everything to the four winds and offered a sacrifice. I poured out a libation on the peak of the mountain. Now, this story of the flood, because it is in Gilgamesh, of course, has its origins in Samaria. Now, notice it is the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story. That does not mean it is the oldest story, okay? Because stories were passed down orally. And in the Jewish tradition, okay, and you'll see where I'm headed with this in a few minutes. In the Jewish tradition, it was known to pass things down orally. Okay, so you have the story of the flood. It's from the oldest known written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Sumerian in origin. In that story, in Gilgamesh, the assembly of gods to decide to punish humanity with a flood. The content of the story is very, very similar to what we see in Genesis 7 to 8, okay, which is the story of Noah. So that's why I was getting at, like, even though the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written story, it does not mean it is the oldest story, because a lot of stories were passed down orally, including stories in the Jewish tradition. Okay, so it is entirely possible that some of the Sumerians heard bits and pieces of the Noah story and then recorded it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, there are similar stories in other civilizations, including a story told by the Babylonians. All right, so this story of a cataclysmic flood is found in a lot of different civilizations in a lot of different periods of time. All right, now, even though the Epic of Gilgamesh is about King Uruk, all right, Gilgamesh is also one of the main characters. Now, Gilgamesh is on a journey to the home of the gods, all right? And what he is looking for is immortality, all right? Because this is a passage Gilgamesh, whither runnest thou? The life which thou seekest, thou wilt not find. For when the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained for their keeping, all right? So that's the passage. He's looking for immortality. Now, within the Epic of Gilgamesh are other stories that we find in the Bible. All right, there is a story. This is why Gilgamesh is looking for immortality, is because immortality was robbed from mankind by a serpent. All right, which is similar to what we see in the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Okay, so there are components of some of the biblical stories, especially the Old Testament stories, in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Right. So again, a lot of our understanding of Mesopotamian religion is going to come from this mythological literature and this epic literature. That's where we find a lot of references to religion, a lot of references to religious practice. And we're going to see the same thing when we get to Greece and Rome as well. Now, some more specific religious functions within the Mesopotamian culture. There was a heavy emphasis on cult practices, okay? And be sure you get this down, all right? In addition to the gods and goddesses, there were demons. The demons were the wicked and restless spirits of the dead. So chances are when you died, you would become a demon. And that's why the afterlife is seen as wretched, and the dead haunting the living and things like that, is because a lot of them become demons. Now, demons can be exorcised through certain rituals where you cast them out, even though the ruler of the city is seen as God's representative and would interpret God's mandates for the city and things like that. There were other religious officials, and those religious officials could be both men and women. Okay? And you offered all types of gifts, all types of sacrifices to the gods and demons, including animals, vegetation, so food offerings, okay, wine, beer, drink offerings, clothing, perfume, physical offerings, okay. So you would offer these to the gods and goddesses and to the demons in hopes that you would appease them and keep them happy, and then everything would be okay. They either wouldn't haunt you, or things would go well for your city state. If you're offering to the gods and goddesses, you want your city state to be successful. So You want to keep them happy, okay? And you don't want the demons to haunt you. You want to keep them happy as well. Okay, so all kinds of things were offered to the gods and goddesses as a way to appease them and keep them happy. Now, how do we know what the will of the gods is for the people of Mesopotamia? They would get involved in divination. Okay, now be sure you get this down. All right, divination was the most widespread of the cultic practices. All right, so within the cults, you would have divination. This is what divination is. It is when you read omens and draw conclusions. Now, you have special people that do that, but the actual act of reading the omens and drawing the conclusions, that's divination. Okay. Now, a lot of times these special people are called oracles. That's what we're going to refer to them when we get to Greece. But the act of reading omens and drawing conclusions, that's divination. All right. And not everybody could do it. That's why you had the religious officials. That's why you had the leaders that were seen as God's representative. They could do it. Not everybody could do it. All right. And an example of one of the methods of divination was to use like the liver of a sacrificed animal. All right, you put it in a fire, and depending on how the liver burnt up or cooked, or the smoke that came off of it or whatever, you could divine what was going to happen based on what would happen to that liver. We also see advances in astronomy in terms of divination, okay? Because remember, the gods and goddesses control natural forces. So it would make sense to look up to the skies to divine what the gods and goddesses wanted. As a result of that, okay, observatories were often built on temples to record celestial activity. And we'll talk about temples in a second, okay? Kings consulted with oracles to make decisions. Again, the kings themselves, because they are God's representatives for the cities, they have a certain degree of power, but then they also work with these oracles, these religious officials, to read omens and draw conclusions as well. All right, but divination is the most widespread cultic practice. It is the reading of the omens and drawing conclusions by a special group of people. Now, within Mesopotamia, there are special religious observances. We talked about that. That's one of the common things that you find in a bunch of different religions, is special days, special observances, okay? So the Mesopotamians had two types of festivals. They had fixed festivals, okay, and movable festivals, okay, or fixed feasts and movable feasts. Fixed feasts, you can probably guess, are static. All right, they are always celebrated at a specific time, such as a new year or a new moon. Okay, anytime there's a new moon, you can expect a fixed feast. Okay, anytime there's a new year, you can expect a fixed feast. All right. Then you had movable feasts or movable festivals, and they're just what they say. They move around, okay, depending on what's going on. All right. And a lot of them are dedicated to a particular god or temple dedications. All right. So we already talked about gods and goddesses often change depending on what happens to the city state. Okay. So you probably want to have a feast to welcome in a new god or to say goodbye to a departing god. The same thing when you build a temple, you want to have a feast. All right. And those aren't set. All right. They happen when they happen. All right. So fixed feasts, movable feasts. Fixed feasts are set. You can always expect them at this point in time. Movable are fluctuate a little bit more depending on what's going on, depending on what's being celebrated. Now, the last thing we're going to mention here, another thing that is common in all religion, is some sort of monumental architecture. And we have talked about in Mesopotamia, there are temples. We have found the archaeological remains of temples. We mentioned that temples are dedicated to the gods and goddesses, to their friends, and to the rulers of the city, who are God's representatives on earth, and to the religious officials as well. Now, the specific type of temple that is associated with Mesopotamia are the ziggurats. Okay. The ziggurats include altars, rooms for the priests, and storerooms. Okay. And we already talked about oftentimes food offerings would be given to the gods and goddesses and the demons. So you want a place that you can keep food, not only for the offerings, but also for day to day life as well. Okay. So within the temple complex, you have altars. That's where you're going to do some of your divination and things like that. You've got room for the priests. You got room for the rulers. You probably have a room set aside for the god or goddesses. Okay. We're going to see that tradition carry over with Greece and Rome. And then you have storage rooms, okay, within the temple. Now, this is what a ziggurat looks like, okay? It kind of resembles a pyramid, all right? But instead of coming to a point at the top, it is flat, all right? Which makes sense because we just talked about a few seconds ago, we had observatories put up here, okay? So you want a level room or a level floor to be able to observe astronomy, all right, so that you could have space for any astronomical instruments, okay, compasses. Not that we have telescopes at this time, but telescopes. But you want a flat area so that you could observe what is going on in nature around you. All right. And you can see from this temple how big of a complex it would be and how there would be room for all those different parts, the rooms for the priests, the storerooms, altars, etc., etc. Okay, so the ziggurats are the specific monumental architecture that we associate with Mesopotamian civilization. Now, that's it. That wraps it up. Real quick overview of Mesopotamia. Gives you an idea of what the religion was like, gives you an idea of some of the religious practices, how it's tied to the history of this civilization. Where we are headed next week, you're going to be doing a little investigation into Mesopotamia. Okay. We're going to be looking at the flood narrative in both Gilgamesh and the story of Noah and doing some comparison and some comparing and contrasting with that flood narrative.